yeah.
Check 2, 3, 4. Check 1, check 2. Yes, that's why they're here.
Good morning. I'm not sure if this mic, oh, it is working, wonderful. If you could all find a seat, we'll begin the, so thank you for Hewlett, or else this conference would not have been able to exist. I'm sure it strikes many of you as a bit disconcordant that during a time of rampaging hyperpartisanship and increasing ideological extremism that we would have a conference about reviving moderation. It doesn't seem a precipitous time for it. And there is a widespread perception that conversations like these may have been appropriate for certain times in American history, but they're not appropriate for this particular time. I find that not particularly persuasive. If we look at history, we find that on a number of occasions when America's center was breaking apart and when hyperpartisanship and division was at its greatest, we find that that's when moderation has historically stepped into the breach and righted the ship. Of course, in 1860, we saw that with Abraham Lincoln. Not many people today think of him as a moderate, but for those who follow history and the career of Abraham Lincoln, you know that he was a moderate in his day. The abolitionists looked at him with great skepticism, as did the slave power. He tried his level best to navigate those treacherous waters and to keep the Union together and the country from falling apart. And so he ran, and he ran as and attempted to govern as a moderate. Of course, it fell apart, but like all good moderates at times when compromises have been played out and opportunities have run dry, that they rallied to the breach to the important causes of the day, which Abraham Lincoln did. But it was an example of moderation arising in a time when we might least expect it. About 100 years later, we saw it again with the arrival of Dwight Eisenhower on the political scene. People forget today how rancid American politics was at that time, how extremism and hyperpartisanship had been rolling through the political landscape. It was with the election of Dwight Eisenhower when Joseph McCarthy was at his peak of political power. If one wants an antecedent to Donald Trump, one would work hard to try to find somebody more appropriate than, say, George Wallace or Joseph McCarthy. Of a failed and unpopular war in Korea, Dwight Eisenhower then walked into the breach, righted the ship, and took control of a Republican Party that was every bit as toxic and dangerous in some ways as many of us fear the Republican Party is today, and rerighted the ship. So there is a long history of moderation arising in the least expected times and places and coming to the rescue in American politics, and it's that prospect that compelled us to have this conversation today. But of course, moderation has a very poor reputation in American politics. Jim Hightower once famously said that the only thing found in the middle of the yellow stripes and dead armadillos. When you're in Washington and you talk about moderation, generally people interpret you as talking about milquetoast deal cutters who stand for very little except getting reelected and offending the least number of people possible. That's how the political cognoscenti think of moderation. And if you look at the two parties today, you find that moderates have not fared very well. While moderates are once a vibrant part of the Republican Party, they've all but been drummed out of the GOP. Are on their heels with all of the energy being held by the progressive left. Yet, for all of that, the two most popular governors in America today, by far, going and away, are two moderates, Charlie Baker of Massachusetts and Larry Hogan of Maryland. By far and away, they are more popular than left or right governors, as we might conventionally think of them in America today. A plurality of voters in the United States self-identify as moderates, and some of the most successful politicians in our adult lives have arrived at their political success through an embrace of moderation. And here I'm thinking of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, who will be speaking later on today, and even Barack Obama, who governed quite moderately, at least relative to where the Democratic Party is today. So moderation, while it has a poor reputation in American politics, I think, unfortunately, is that perception is mistaken. It's stronger than we might think. Moderation also has a poor reputation intellectually. In the public intellectual class, of course, moral clarity, powerfully argued, is the coin of the realm, something that moderates are a bit leery of engaging in. And yet, for all of that, some of the most impressive and important public intellectuals of the 20th century have embraced the cause of moderation as we might understand it today. And by that I mean people like Raymond Aron, Isaiah Berlin, Albert Camus, Jose Ortega y Gasset, Michael Oakeshott, Karl Popper. None of these are intellectual lightweights, all of whom more or less find themselves in the same world that the Niskanen Center finds itself in. But be that as it may, moderation tends to be out of fashion today. Yet we all sense a growing dread in America today that what we lack is exactly this. Even ideologues who are married to the left or the right, or those more principled politicians, I think have a sense of dread that the center is falling apart. We are increasingly at each other's throats, and the lubricant of toleration, pluralism, and moderation, which allows for the engine of government and public policy to go forward, is increasingly in danger. And without that sort of sense of moderation, that we have much more dangerous times in front of us. It's altogether fitting, then, that our welcoming address would come from someone like David Brooks. David is an author and columnist who has become one of the most influential public intellectuals of our time. While in college, he was offered a job by William F. Buckley, no moderate, which led him to begin working for the National Review. He subsequently became a prominent commentator at many other publications and media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, NPR, and PBS NewsHour. Since 2003, he has become a columnist for the New York Times, where he has drawn the wrath of liberals and conservatives alike. His columns have increasingly moved away from politics, social science, and neuroscience towards broad themes of faith and morality. In 2017, he said that, quote, "One of my callings is to represent a certain moderate Republican Whig political philosophy, and the other is to try to shift the conversation more in a moral and theological direction." Both of these conversations, I think, are critically important today, and so it is my delight to have David Brooks off our conference today. David?
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be with Niskanen. In a very short period of time, Niskanen has become one of our most creative intellectual centers. It's like when you throw off the shackles of ideology, suddenly there's a birth of creativity and idea and vitality, and Niskanen has been that. Now, I confess, I consider myself a moderate today. I haven't always been a moderate. I grew up in Greenwich Village in the 1960s, and I was a man of the left, a child of the left. When I was in second grade, I wrote on the chalkboard that Julie Nixon was a Nazi. I'm not sure why I thought she was a Nazi, but I was fighting the man, the establishment, and I got paddled for it. So I've paid my price for being a radical. And then in 1965, well, earlier actually, when I was 4 years old, my parents took me to a be-in in Central Park, where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things the hippies did was they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 4, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, so I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. That was sort of my first step over to the right. And so I like to think even then I was flexible. I was ideologically flexible. And then when I was 17, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which is a school, the best thing about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. So, and there, even though it has a reputation for being a conservative school, I was super left. In those days, I wrote a parody of William F. Buckley for being a name-dropping blowhard. And he came to campus and he gave a speech, and the parody was like in college, Buckley formed 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley and one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And so it was like that spirit. And at the end of his speech, he said, "David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job." And that was the big break of my career, actually. Sadly, I wasn't in the audience. I was actually that week out in California debating Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman did a show called Tyranny of the Status Quo on PBS, where it was Milton Talks to the Young. And I'm a democratic socialist, and I would regurgitate some point I'd read somewhere, and he would destroy it in about 6 words. And then the show is mostly the camera lingering on my face while I try to think of something to say. And you can actually go on YouTube today and find a 22-year-old David Brooks being utterly flummoxed and embarrassed by Milton Friedman. And so that, I never became a Milton Friedman conservative, but I gradually moved over to the right. Chicago forced me to read Edmund Burke. I became an admirer of Alexander Hamilton, who's a Latino hip-hop star from the Bronx, or from the Heights. And I became a Whig. And it took me a little while. We all have to try on different pieces of clothing before we find out where we are, but I'm basically a Whig, or a rhino, as we say. And I'm one of those people, one of many probably in this room, who could never vote for Trump on racial grounds alone, frankly, and on moral grounds. And so I assumed that in 2020 I would vote for the Democrats. And I realized it would take a lot of work for the Democrats to turn away my vote. They're doing that work very exceptionally well. And so I probably could never vote for any candidate who supported the Green New Deal. You know, I lived through the 20th century. I know what central planning does. And I don't think we really need to learn those lessons again. Richard Weaver had a saying, the problem with the next generation is they haven't read the minutes to the last meeting. And so if we're going to have to relearn the lessons of central planning again, I really don't want to learn them. So I'm homeless. I'm politically homeless. And when Niskanen came out with a lot of Will Wilkerson, a lot of the reports they've come out with Brink, suddenly I've read them and I thought, yeah, that's a home. There are a lot of people who come from different directions but have come to the same place. And a lot of people in this room are in that same place. The crucial thing is moderates can't just be against, just can't be against left and right. I've sort of been impressed by the movement No Labels, but I've always thought that you can't start a movement whose first word is no. You have to be for something. And so you want a vision. And so the question is, what is the passionate ideal that moderates are for? Frankly, Isaiah Berlin, Raymond Aron, and others, not good enough. We're not going to start a movement whose primary motivating engine for the masses is Oakshott. There has to be an animating idea. Successful political and cultural movements have a radioactive thought. Now, in 1999, Andrew Delbanco wrote a book called The Real American Dream, and he divided American history according to the big radioactive thoughts that govern the different stages. The first era, the radioactive thought was God. The Puritans came here, saw the plentiful nature of this continent, and decided God's plan for humanity could be completed on earth, and that we could get really rich in the process. And so they were striving to realize God's plan for humanity. Virginia and Massachusetts were conceived in a bed of religion. Jonathan Edwards said that this is a place for the new and most glorious state of the church. Cotton Mather gave a famous sermon called God's City, America. Jonathan Winthrop talked about the sacred of the shining city on a hill. And he didn't mean that in a good way, by the way. When Reagan twisted it, he twisted around as something good. When Winthrop first uttered the statement, he said, "We are the shining city on the hill. God's plans for humanity rest on us, and we're screwing it up." It was a Jeremiad. And America was built, as the historian Sack Van Berkovich said, on the nature of our Jeremiads, on we're failing God. And that was the animating principle early on, and it lasted through the Revolution. John Adams said, "I always considered the settlement of America with reverence and wonder as the opening of a grand scene in design and providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish parts of the earth. We were the universal nation that was going to liberate the earth." And that created a lot of anxiety. The second animating idea, which followed probably around 1830, was nation. The period of Western settlement was a period of adolescent pride, America becoming aware of itself, and the height of American exceptionalism. Webster wrote his dictionary knowing that even though there were only 33 million Americans when he wrote it, there would be 40 million soon. They completely anticipated that America would be the superpower of the earth. Tocqueville found an irritable patriotism because Americans were so given to the idea of nation. The pioneer experience was an experience of radical hopefulness, of future orientation. They passed by perfectly good farmland in Kentucky because they were convinced something better was on the other side, and they just kept going west. There's a great book called Giants of the Earth, which I think is set in the Dakotas, and there's a farmer leading around a guy to his farm, and he says, "Well, this is where my crops are, this is where my barn is, this is where my house is," and the visitor says, "Well, I don't see any of that." And he said, "Well, I haven't built it yet, it's in the future." And that, in the essence, was the spirit of that sense of national destiny. Melville described it in White Jacket, his novel. "We Americans are the particular chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the mark of liberties of the world. God has predestined mankind, expects great things from our race, and great things we feel in our souls." And so this sort of fervent nationalism fueled America through the 19th century, up to TR, and maybe through World War II. And that sense of American exceptional, the unique destiny of America. That phase, animated by nation, ended, Delbanco says, around the late 50s, early 60s. And a new ideal animated America, and that was the ideal of self. It was the problem with the nation period was that it was a guest house nation. If you were a white Protestant, it was your house. If you were not, you were just a guest. And you could be accepted in American society if you played by the Protestant rules, but if you didn't, you were excised. And so that was going to be unacceptable to people. And then in the 1950s, people felt conformity crushing them. Service to community, service to nation felt like a crushing conformity. And so there were all these books, The Organization Man, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. People wanted to break out. And in 1962, you really see the shift. A bunch of radicals got together in Port Huron, Michigan, and put together the Port Huron Statement, which was a statement of individualism. We want to be free to be ourselves. Betty Friedan wrote her book. The hippies came out, the self-esteem movement. It was about the liberation of self, the emancipation of self. And that, too, is a radioactive, powerful ideal. It was symbolized in my childhood by one of the great events of my childhood, which was Super Bowl III. In Super Bowl III, two quarterbacks faced off against each other, and one was an organization man for the Baltimore Colts, a guy named Johnny Unitas. Crew cut, very boring, high-top sneakers, classic 1950s guy. The guy on the other side of the field grew up just miles away from Johnny Unitas in western Pennsylvania, but 10 years apart. And that was Joe Namath. Namath had long hair, $5,000 fur coats. He was a swinger. He was anti-institutional. He wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. And Johnny Unitas would not have read it in that memoir. And so that symbolized the shift in culture, away from organization and to self. Suddenly it was cool to be young, not old, expressive, not reticent, casual, not formal, rebel, not a conformist, individual, not institutional. It was all about liberation. Liberated by education from the bonds of religion, liberated by democracy from the bonds of class, liberated by culture from restrictions on sex and free expression, liberated by technology from poverty, liberated by the ballot box from government. And the era of self had a left-wing version, which was about social and lifestyle liberation, and it had a right-wing version, which was about economic liberation, the Reagan agenda. And it produced a lot of good things. We have a much more creative economy, creative culture, because we've been individually liberated. But everything turns bad when you take it to the extreme, and we've pretty much run out the string on 60 years of hyper-individualism. We've divided the nation one from another, and we've divided the links from another. 35% of Americans over 45 are chronically lonely. More than 50% of Americans say that no one knows them well. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. Since 1990, the suicide rate is up 30%. Among teenagers between 7 and 17, the suicide rate is up 70%. And suicide is a proxy for loneliness. Life expectancy in America is declining, not rising. We have the deaths of despair. We have an era of tremendous distrust. If you ask people a generation ago, do you trust the institutions of your society? 75 and 80% said yes. Now it's down to 22%. If you asked people a generation ago, do you trust your neighbors? Are the people around you basically trustworthy? You got about 60% said, yeah, they're basically trustworthy. Now it's 32% say they can trust their neighbors, and 18% of millennials. The younger you get, the more distrust there is. And so we've had a period of weakening institutions, weakening bonds, drifting us apart. Institutions are not something that shape us. They're something, as Yuval Levin says, that we perform upon. And so we have sort of taken self to the extreme. And so in my view, we've run out of self. We've run out the string on the radioactivity of that idea, and people are looking for something new. And so what you get, there's a social theorist whose name I'm forgetting, but she says that culture moves forwards in what she calls the ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet phase. There's a problem. Society creates a collective response to it, and a new radioactive idea takes hold, and it ratchets up. It lasts for a while, and then it stops working. And people have to hatchet it up. They have to chop up the culture. And then they pivot over, because people are ingenious, they find another response, and then you get another ratchet. It's basically a version of paradigm shift from Kuhn. That paradigms work for a while, they stop working, and then you get a period of paradigm competition as people try to replace the old paradigm. And to me, Donald Trump just destroyed the old paradigm. He destroyed the Reagan Republican Party. He destroyed the paradigm that was, frankly, outdated. I liken him to Abbie Hoffman. Abbie Hoffman was not a great political genius, but he was good at political theory and exposing the weaknesses of the old system. And Donald Trump is our Abbie Hoffman. So now we have other people presenting radioactive ideas to us. And the first is Donald Trump. He wants to replace the idea of self with the idea of tribe. That we need more ethnic cohesion, we need to return to an era of fervent patriotism and cohesion around our ethnic identity, our white ethnic identity. We need to go back to a white America that frankly is never coming back. Now, tribe seems like patriotism, it seems like a return to nation, but it's not. That old nationalism was based on the idea we're a universal nation. We're the home of all mankind. We're the last best hope of Earth. Trump's tribalism is not based on that idea. It's a European-style nationalism. It's a tribal mentality based not on an abundance mentality, but on a scarcity mentality. It's not based on mutual affection, it's based on mutual hatred for the other. It's always friend-enemy distinctions, us, them, zero-sum mindset, the outsiders threaten us, life is conflict, politics is war, ideas are combat, mistrust is the worldview, erect walls, build barriers. And tribe is a very radioactive idea. It always has been, and it always will be, and it's motivating a lot of people. And so that's a very powerful ideal to go up against. Now the left has another idea, and their idea is social justice. The left sees division in society. They tell a story of oppression. The structure of life is oppressor-oppressed. The story of American history is the economy is about oppressor-oppressed. There's class oppression. The story of relations between the races is oppressor-oppressed. There's racial oppression. The relationship between the genders is a story of oppression. There's sexist oppression. And that's a very meaningful idea to people. Jonathan Haidt once wrote, "A funny thing happens when you take human beings whose minds evolved for tribal warfare and us-them thinking, and you fill those minds with binary dimensions. You tell them that one side of the binary is good and the other is bad. You turn on their ancient tribal circuits, preparing them for battle. Many students find this thrilling. It fills them with a sense of meaning and purpose." And the oppressor-oppressed social justice narrative fills a lot of people with a sense of meaning and purpose. And of course, like tribalism, it's based on a lot of truth. And so you see the rise of that. And the response, like with all stories of oppression, is how do you get the weak strong? You take over the state. You centralize power of the state and ally it with the proletariat. And so that's where the left is going. Now, the two current ideas that are out there, tribalism and social justice, are not particularly attractive to me. They're not attractive because they're both based on conflict and war. That life is a series of conflicts, one side, one the other. They both have an authoritarian strain, that it's about concentrating power in the state. They both are based on a scarcity mindset. Both of them are based on the idea that conflict is the central dynamic in human affairs. Both of them are based on the central fantasy of our time, which is that the other half of the nation can be conquered and it will disappear. It's based on the fantasy that you can somehow magically get 70% of the United States Senate and govern forever and do everything you want. And that will never happen. And so these are visions that first lead to conflict and second are politically unrealistic. We live in a closely divided country. We need other people. And so moderates have to come up with an animating idea, an idea that people can legitimately devote their lives to, that is an alternative to tribalism and social justice. What is that idea? Well, look at the problems we face. To me, the core problem America faces is the problem of division. The problem of division, fragmentation, crisis of connection, alienation, and distrust. We have a widening economic divide between the rich and poor. We have a widening cultural divide between the educated and less educated, a widening divide between rural and urban, between black and white, native and immigrant, between left and right. And so the big questions of our time is, how do you maintain cohesion as we become majority minority? How can you increase social mobility in the face of technological change? How can you bind our political system so it can deal with the big challenges like global warming? How can you strengthen families and communities and social capital at a time when everything is falling apart? These are just the big challenges. And to me, the right response and the big animating idea is found in Leviticus and Matthew. It's the second commandment, love your neighbor. The left and the right are ideologies of anger and political war. But the right response to that is fraternity, solidarity, affection, and relationship. Love your neighbor is a cause that people throughout centuries have given their lives to. It's a vision of what Josiah Royce called the beloved community, where we actually reach across and try to greet each other with understanding, and if you want to be mushy about it, love. We're in the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth, but you somehow have to talk that way. And so to me, human society is bound by our common love for each other as fellow Americans, and love and fellowship is the ultimate moderate emotion. And it suggests an agenda. There are 4 affections that hold our society together. And it seems to me the job for moderates is to build those affections. The first affection that bind us together is our love for our kids. Not just our biological kids, but the kids around us. This is a great binding force in any community across difference. So the first goal for a moderate movement is to make sure kids grow up in a web of loving relationships. Government can help. Nurse-family partnerships, child tax credits, early childhood education, parental leave, schools that nurture relationship through social and emotional learning. The second great affection is our calling for the work of our hands. Our work is what binds us to society. It gives us a social role. It gives us something to do, a way to feel connected to others in service. So moderates can use government to help people develop their ties to their vocation and to the people they work with. Apprenticeship tracks, increasing the earned income tax credit, wage subsidies, moving subsidies, or in Cass's idea of work councils, which are like health clubs to give you training and representation through your job. Reshape capitalism so it's not just about maximizing shareholder value, but about serving community. A third affection is to our place. We love our towns. I go around the country for this. I'm involved in this thing at the Aspen Institute called WEAVE, the Social Fabric Project. And we go around meeting community builders all around the country, and I always ask this question: what layer of society are you most attached to? Is it your block, your neighborhood, your town, your county, your state, your country, or all of humanity? About 5% say all of humanity. 90% say my town. I personally feel most attached to the nation, but I'm in a minority. They really feel attached to their town. They trust their town. They would lay down their life for their town. And so we need to nourish the affection for place. And the way you do that, partly through a national service program where we pay people to serve their community in any way they saw fit, but partly you have to devolve power down to the local community. The community is a group of people with a common story. A community is a group of people with a common project. So if we devolve power away from Washington to local government, you get people actively building community with each other. And so a process of radical decentralization is the third of the affections and the third item of the agenda. The fourth affection is just our nation and our relationships to our kind. I was in the Metropolitan Museum with a friend of mine whose family came over here in the 16th century, who is related to George Washington. And we were looking at a portrait of Washington, and he innocently asked me, "What's it like for you? Like, I am actually related to him. He really is the father of my country, but you have no relation to George Washington. What's it like for you to look at him?" I was like, that thought never occurred to me. Of course he's the father of my nation. And so we just feel a natural affinity to being part of this nation. And the division of that is a division of race. We used to talk, when I was growing up, of racial integration. That was the core idea, frankly, for American progressives. We don't talk about integration anymore. Republicans don't talk about it because it's part of more tribal. Democrats don't talk about it because in multicultural ethos, racial integration can be hegemonic. And so as a result, American schools are more segregated than the 1970s. Neighborhoods are more segregated than the 1970s. Workplaces are more segregated than the 1970s. Wealth is more segregated. Racism is the core sin of the country. Any movement has to put racial integration foremost as a process of social integration. Basically, we need to tell a story. Moderation is not an ideology, it's a way of being. It's a way of talking to other people, and from them you see how different we all are from each other. Moderation is humility of the mind, but ardor of the heart. When you talk to people, actually converse with people unlike yourself, you realize that Politics is a competition between partial truths, and you're just trying to find the right balance. There's no one ideology, as Jerry has written, that solves all our problems. You see that creativity is syncretistic. It calls from pulling items from here and from there. You see the danger of reducing yourself to a single identity and the fanaticism that arises out of that. These are all epistemological humility that come about when you talk to people and respect and love people across difference. You see that politics is a limited activity. There's a great Samuel Johnson couplet, of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure. The things that really matter to us are our relationships to each other and our character. Politics is important, but it's not that important. And so don't get so hyped up about it. You don't look to base your identity on politics. That's asking of politics more than politics can deliver. It's idolizing politics. And so that's all epistemological humility. But at the core of moderation is our love for one another. And our love to see connection in each other, to go down to the deepest level of each other, reach across our divides, and actually connect on some intimate level. The sort of relationship that actually produces joy. Now, it's hard in this country to talk about a politics of love. It seems like the politics of meaning, remember that? But it is, in a divided country, in a fragmented country, in an angry country, it seems like that's the most proper emotional posture. To the vocations we love, to the creeds we love, to the country we love, to each other. And that act of reaching out and seeking solidarity and friendship and relationship is the ultimate moderate cause. Thank you.
What a brilliant talk. The idea of cultivating love and affection certainly suggests that for moderates, we need to blow up our Twitter accounts. Or at least I have to blow up mine. We have time for one and only one question before we move to our next panel, which will allow us to talk in more granularity about why the center seems to be fraying and failing to hold. But if we have a question for David, I will go to Emil.
Unlike you, I became a moderate Republican when I was 12 years old out of admiration for Dwight Eisenhower, and people in this room who know me will say I haven't moved, the world has changed, but I haven't. And, you know, I believe fervently in what you say, and yet the moment doesn't seem quite right, if I can put it that way, to love thy neighbor as the animating idea. This seems to be a moment right now when you have to choose sides and fight, because I think there is a fundamental threat to everything that we believe in terms of basic American democratic values. I think this is a moment, it may pass, but for now, I think we have to choose sides and fight, which is not the idea of moderation that you articulate and that in which I want to believe. And I'd be curious about your reaction to that.
Yeah, you know, what we do shapes who we are. And if we decide the idea is to fight, then we become fighters. And to me, when you become a fighter, you know, I was with the Wall Street Journal in the 90s, and I covered a lot of great events. And I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa, the Oslo peace process. It was all about falling barriers and people coming together. I covered one event at the end, which I barely paid attention to, the Yugoslav Civil War. And in retrospect, that was the most important event of that era, because it led to the succession of ethnic identity, authoritarianism, and tribalism that we've seen since. And that trend is not just a move, it's a spiral, as each side responds to the horror of the other. And each side degrades themselves in that process. And the only way you get out of that spiral is by somebody making a brave stand and saying, no, that's not who I am. And that's frankly the lesson of Martin Luther King. it was very possible to argue, as people before and after King did, no, we need to fight. And he said, no, you answer hatred with love. And he says, if you just keep on loving on people, they'll hate you for a little while, but eventually they'll break under the power of your love. And he did that partly as a strategy for social change, partly to appeal to the better angels of people's nature, but partly out of awareness of his own sinfulness. And that once you adopt an attitude of hatred and opposition, then you destroy a little piece of yourself. And if you do that, you've undermined anything that can lead to a political solution. So to me, the answer is actually the opposite of not falling into the logic of hate versus hate, but breaking out of that spiral and breaking out of that logic with a different language. And that is sort of what I think the country is ready for. Thank you very much.
Well, under the guidance of my colleague Jeff Caberservice, I've been reading a lot of Lincoln lately, who I think is really the founding father of this country, at least this modern nation that we have. And one of the things that's most striking is the rhetoric of love from Abraham Lincoln, even in the midst of the bloodiest Civil War up to that point in global history. The carnage that followed was tremendous, but all during it, prior to the war and in the conduct of the war and as it was winding down, it was a constant admonition from Lincoln with regards to the fact that these are our brothers and that we must love, and that this horrible war needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved not with fury and with vengeance, but with love and reconciliation. Tremendously powerful. And of course, the contemporaneous version might be looking at Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who wove together a nation out of the least fertile fields of affection and love, and yet was a tremendous vehicle for exactly that, in a place which is most surprising that we would be very surprised to see. It seems constantly interesting to me that during the worst periods of division and rancor and hatred and suspicion, that constantly those situations have given birth to exactly the kind of moderation and politics of love that David Brooks so eloquently offered here today. But we'll move on with a bit more granularity. My colleague Brink Lindsay now will convene a panel to discuss exactly why it is the center is not holding, and we'll get into a wonderful conversation on that front to help inform the rest of our conversations today. So thank you. And Brink, why don't you and the rest of the speakers come up?
Good morning, everyone.
Very persuasive.
Good morning, everyone. Again, without the feedback. Great. I'm Brink Lindsay, Vice President for Policy at Niskanen Center. Delighted to be moderating our kickoff panel for this conference on why the center isn't holding. We have great participants here, Francis Lee from the University of Maryland, Martin Gurry, author of the recent, very important book, The Revolt of the Public, and Margaret Hoover from PBS's Firing Line, amongst other affiliations. For more details about speaker handouts, but we'll just dive right in. In the famous movie about teen angst, Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean stares up at his parents at some point and yells, "You're tearing me apart." These days, in our sort of national living out of some kind of adolescent meltdown, the country politically seems to be yelling, "You're tearing me apart," and in many different directions. What actually is driving this polarization, this sort of galloping to the extremes, this fraying of the social fabric? We have many ways of putting it. I believe the state of affairs today is fairly massively overdetermined. That is, there is a host of causes that are centrifugal forces that are undermining unity and sowing division. I want to, most obviously, the political sorting of the two parties into ideological parties of left and right, and then the development of those ideologies towards greater extremism over time, so that the two sides are drifting farther and farther apart. That's the most obvious feature of our scene today. We'll get there. I want to tackle something first off that a couple of contributing factors that get considerably less attention, but that I think are very important. I want to start with Francis Lee and with the institutional game theory dynamics. Put aside ideology, put aside the content of people's belief systems. Just the way the game is played in Washington, D.C. is changing because the two parties now, as opposed to how it was when I was a kid and the Democrats had reliable, stable majorities in Congress, these days, both parties are within striking distance of power at all times, and that leads to what kind of mischief, Frances?
Hi. Well, I'll begin just by pointing to what a ferociously competitive environment we are in the midst of right now. The 2016 election was excruciatingly close, but we haven't had a presidential landslide where a presidential candidate wins all across the country in 30 years. We've had divided government 75% of the time since 1980. Also, since 1980, Democrats and Republicans have each held majority status in the House of Representatives for 10 Congresses. Since 1980, Democrats have held a majority in the Senate for 9 Congresses and Republicans for 11. So this even balance in a 50-50 country. Constant competition where every election holds out the possibility of a change of party control of one institution or another. That is a factor undercutting incentives for bipartisanship. You can see it in terms of how it affects bipartisanship in Congress, the incentives for bipartisanship. A minority party, a party that has less institutional power than it believes it can have in the near future, doesn't want to work productively with the majority party, because in doing so, it makes the case for the status quo division of institutional power. It says that we can accomplish things that we both support even though we're in the minority. Under circumstances where an out party sees a path back in, it wants to put forward partisan alternatives. It wants to say, they want to do this, but we have better ideas. So we don't want to work together. We want to lay down a bright line and establish how we would do things better. And so it's the way of making a case for your own side. Why should you get power back? It's because you have a better set of ideas. So that resisting of bipartisan cooperation under these highly competitive conditions. And also, just in terms of game theory, it doesn't make as much sense to cut a deal right now if you think you're going to be in a better position 2 years from now. And so this constant preoccupation with the next election. As soon as an election happens, we look towards the next one. We begin to speculate immediately after the 2018 elections. Well, what will happen in 2020? You know, the preoccupation with politics in an environment of very close party competition. There's a lot more partisan collective action in Congress than there used to be, where the parties meet continually to strategize, always, of course, looking towards their political stakes, to political opportunities that are available to make their party look more attractive than the opposition. So many caucus meetings. But this is not how Congress has always worked. It's not how the Congress of the 20th century worked. The Democratic caucus was dormant for 50 years before 1970, just didn't even meet. Democrats in the Senate didn't start with their weekly meetings until after the 1980 elections, until they went into the minority. You begin to see rising caucus activity among House Republicans after 1980, with Reagan in the White House and with Republicans in control of the Senate. Democrats then began to step up their activity after 1994. So this constant, escalating caucus activity, where all the meetings that members have outside of what they have to do in their own personal offices are in partisan settings. And so this reinforces partisan identity. But at its root, it got underway as competition for majority control was reintroduced into American politics. Finally, I would just flag the inordinate amount of activity around party messaging in a Congress where it's so tightly competitive between the parties, that it's become routine, standard operating procedure to stage votes for the purposes of highlighting the differences between the parties. We are a better alternative. This is a case you want to make with a messaging vote. We're a better alternative than these guys because of the following contrast we want to draw. So we try to stage votes to put ourselves on the right side of public opinion and put the other side on the wrong side of public opinion. And you've seen the development of this massive infrastructure inside the legislative branch, both House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, around messaging. This growth of messaging operations. Nearly half of all the staff who work for our Senate leadership offices work on communications. In the House, it's around a third. And that growth has been underway in this era of party competition. It started in the Senate in the 1980s, just as competition for control of the Senate returned, and it got underway in the House in the 1990s with that arms race between the parties to more effectively wage a messaging battle against the other side. I don't think you can understand the toxic partisanship in today's Washington without some reference to the ferocious knife's edge competition between the parties that's characterized our era.
So you focused on the dynamics within the legislature. I want to back up and look as well at the dysfunctions about the relationship between the legislature and the executive. And there we have another wrinkle in our system that is a source of mischief, which is that we are a presidential system with separation of powers. As a political scientist, Juan Linz, who spent a lot of time worrying a great deal about the inherent instability of presidential systems. The problem with political science is the N for your sample size is always terribly small, but for presidential systems generally are much more unstable than parliamentary systems. Also, presidential systems are disproportionately Latin American, so it could be Latin America is dysfunctional because of presidential systems or vice versa, don't know. But there is certainly a logic to the problem of presidential systems, which is that you can have divided government and you can have the executive branch and the legislative branch both claiming some kind of popular mandate, and if they can't cooperate, then you have the potential for showdowns, obstructionism, extra-legal flanking maneuvers, and coups. So we've got that. We've had that since the get-go, but now we have that system operating in a political game where all the players have been trained for sort of maximal blood sport. So how do those fit together to exaggerate the problems?
Well, cooperation across the branches is difficult, even when the same party controls the Congress and the president. So that's a fact of life about our system. But under contemporary pressures, Now, of course, we'll be discussing a whole variety of other factors that play into partisan conflict on this panel, but I'll just focus on party competition in the sense that the party not controlling the presidency looks to the presidents who have prevailed in recent years. They've prevailed by narrow margins. They hold their office tenuously. It's easy to see a way in which you could defeat them for re-election or defeat their party's continuation in the presidency. So how do you do that? Well, you can't give the president a win under those conditions. If you give the president a win, then you're making a case. You're allowing him to make a case that he's doing a good job. You also don't want to give him bipartisan legitimacy. That if you extend support to a president of the opposing party, that's a way of saying that you endorse that president. And so there's a resistance to doing it. Political incentives are more contrary to doing that in the current environment than they are in most periods. I mean, throughout the 20th century, sort of conventional wisdom among political scientists and commentators, there was a sun party and a moon party, a dominant party and a secondary party. That after 1932, for decades, that was the Democratic Party. But if you look back before 1932, the Republican Party was the dominant party in national government. That it's just we're in the midst of a very unusual period of this constant switching majorities, these narrow majorities, and that changes the incentives that affect interbranch relationships as well as the relationships between the parties in the legislature.
So this is an sort of idiosyncratic or America-specific contributing factor to what we're going through, but we are not unique in what we're going through. We're seeing polarization and populist upheaval all around the world, and certainly in advanced democracies on both sides of the Atlantic. So when we're looking for more general causes, we need to look for factors that are common not only to us but to other countries experiencing similar kinds of turmoil. To me, the acid test is the Poland test. Here in America, we've got this ongoing kind of sterile battle between what's driving people crazy? Is it economic anxiety or is it cultural backlash / racism? I happen to think both are interrelated and both are going on. But Poland is in the midst of populist upheaval and democratic deconsolidation. Having been a miracle economy with one of the rapidest growth rates in Europe in the past decade or so, and with virtually no immigration or refugee crisis at all to roil the public. So what's going on there? Martin Gurry has identified a factor that is undermining political and social cohesion that is universal, and that is the advent of information abundance. It's social media, but it's beyond that. It's 500 channels and the internet and plus Facebook and Twitter. What does this sort of information overload, how does this translate into the difficulties we're experiencing now?
Well, I guess my job is to talk about information and power. And I saw a flicker of panic in people's faces when I say that. So let me start with a story. Once upon a time, I probably had the least glamorous job in CIA. I was an analyst of global media. And early on, it was a pretty straightforward job. The amount of open information was remarkably small. Every country had some equivalent of the New York Times that set the news agenda. So if the principals asked questions, we knew where to go for an answer. Sometime around the turn of the millennium, the new century, the information environment went haywire. We were watching this in our little corner of CIA. Essentially, a tsunami of information began sweeping over the world. That's not just a phrase. The year 2001 produced double the information of all of previous history. The year 2002 doubled 2001. And that has pretty much, it's kind of gone up and down a little bit, but pretty much that trend has continued. You chart that, it looks like a tsunami, like a gigantic wave. We observed behind that tsunami as it swept over the world, tremendous and increasing social and political turbulence. Angry and mocking voices where before there had been silence. First inkling or indication of this mutinous public that has since smashed political parties, overthrown dictators, and of course elected outlandish populists to office. I learned, to my surprise, that the overabundance of information that you mentioned is subversive of the established order. Now, the reasons are very complex, but the effects are demonstrable and clear. Essentially, the institutions that sustain modern society require a sort of proprietary command over the information in their own domains. When that command is surrendered, public trust evaporates, and these institutions start to bleed authority and legitimacy. And by the way, and I hope we take this into account in this conference, I'm not just talking politics. It's every institution that, like I said, we have inherited from the industrial age. Of course, the news media, the corporation, the university, you name it, there is a crisis of authority that is affecting those institutions. If I were to say what the great conflict of our moment is from my research, I don't think it's left versus right, which I've heard a lot about already. I don't think it's authoritarian versus democrat. I think it's the elites who basically manage these institutions and have much support in the public doing that, against a network public that is the producer of that information and is not binary, it's not particularly it's not particularly ideological, it's not particularly program-minded, it's not particularly policy-minded, but it is ferociously hostile to the established order. And that public, if you look at the data, it seems to me, does not break easily into left and right. If you look at the yellow vest protesters in France, what the heck are they? And if you look at Macron, what the heck was he? So it's not that clear cut, but there is this sense in the public that the elites and the institutions, number one, have grown too distant from them, and number two, have failed them. And you can argue whether empirically that is true or not, but I think it's a very powerful perception in the public. The public is not a thing, it's many things. We used to be a mass audience, and if you think of the mass audience as a gigantic mirror that the institutions held up to us, that mirror has just basically been thrown on the ground and shattered, and that's the public now. And we're all living in little shards and segments of that. And I think everything I've heard about the Niskanen Center today, that's a shard, okay? You're sitting in your, Donald Trump. When you are in that condition, and you are so ferociously against, and again, that's a question of why has that happened, that the public is that way. You can only unify by picking a target and going after it. If you took, for example, the Tea Party, you could be a Tea Partier who was an extremely secular libertarian, or you could be a Tea Partier who was an extremely devout evangelist Christian. These people had nothing in common except they despised Barack Obama and his policies. If you looked at the protesters in Tahrir Square, you could have socialists who were probably atheists, all the way to the other side, Muslim Brotherhood youth. These people had no policies in common, no ideologies in common, no lifestyle in common, but they hated and loathed Hosni Mubarak, and they were willing to put their lives at risk to see him gone.
So that when this phenomenon of the information age has been something that's been widely remarked on for quite some time, and in particular this idea that officialdom can't control information like it used to has been around for a while. When this was first becoming apparent, it was generally told as a very sunny story with a distinctly libertarian spin. We talked about the CNN effect, that where Stalin could kill millions in Ukraine and have plausible deniability that was happening. Dictators couldn't do that anymore. We would see what they were doing. I remember Esther Dyson, the Silicon Valley guru, giving a talk at the Cato Institute where I worked once on the end of the official story, that once upon a time the elites had an official story, and that was, you know, that is then they conveyed that to a passive receiving public, and that was it. But now that official story is broken down, and the way Esther was telling it at the time, yay, the officials we were having in mind were bad guys that we wanted to see having less authority. What I think a lot of libertarians didn't see in all of this kind of dynamic, and particularly the kind of declining trust in institutions, we thought, okay, this is great. This is awakening people and bringing out their inner libertarian, that if they're distrusting authority, that means they're discovering principles of decentralized and smaller government. Didn't turn out that way at all. There's no ideological coherence to this sort of force of negation at all. It's just the establishment is rotten.
Well, I talk about a bonfire of the narratives. I think that has very much happened. I think it's very hard. Essentially, the old narratives assumed kind of a, you trust us. Yeah, many pieces of this narrative probably you can refute. But the whole thing is going to take you to a place that you want to be at, and we in the olden days sign on to that. I think today there is, as you say, a tremendous force of negation. Every narrative, and it's not just the official narratives, the unofficials as well. If you are Al-Qaeda and you're sitting around talking about the far enemy or something like that, well, all your dictators are falling in the near enemy. So everything about, everything that tries to cohere as a story immediately gets attacked. I'm with David. We cannot, as human beings, I mean, there's a lot of evidence to this, exist without shared stories that begin with who am I, and end with who are we as a nation. There's a kind of a embedding all the way up. Without those, we start to tip into what I think is the peril, which is not authoritarianism. I think we are as far from authoritarianism in this broken, shattered environment that I've described as you can get. It's nihilism, is the sense that there are people who define the nihilist as somebody who believes that destruction of an institution, for example, but sometimes it's just a person who picks up a gun and destroys human lives. Destruction is a form of progress.
So in this nihilistic environment, which can create great openings for demagogues and authoritarians if they're clever and opportunistic, the way I understand the logic of your argument, that in this nihilistic environment, nobody trusts officials, and why is that? There's a story. Well, people don't trust elites anymore because elites are really screwed up. They've made one failure after another, and not just political, but social elites generally. Chris Hayes's book, Twilight of the Elites, just marches through the O's and tells one story after another of beloved social institutions disappointing us, from not only in politics with the Iraq War and the financial crisis, but in Major League Baseball with the steroids crisis, and Catholic Church with the child abuse scandal. So one place after another, the elites have let us down. But it isn't necessary, though, that they are letting us down any more than in the past. It could simply be that when they let us down, it's much more apparent than in the past. So,
I mean, that's an argument that I make in the book, and of course it's hard to tease apart. I've been accused of criticizing modern government for having failed. Well, I haven't, really. I'm trying to explain that people perceive this. And it's hard to tell, to draw the line between empirically what is correct in these critiques of the elites and of the institutions, and what is just a kind of, I don't know, visceral dislike of the way things are right now, which I think in part is derived from what David mentioned, which is we're demanding existential rewards from politics. That's never going to happen. That's never going to. We want politics to make our lives meaningful. Well, that's never going to happen. You look at the indignados and the tent people protests in Israel, and there was this longing. You people in government are not giving us meaningful lives, and so part of it, I think, is empirical. I think you look at the elites, and there's a way you can make a case that the industrial elites who have a particular way of dealing with crises, which is top down, and these eruptions, therefore, invariably shock and surprise them. It's amazing, almost funny, to watch time after time after time. Emmanuel Macron had no idea of what hit him. He was looking up. He wasn't looking down. So, I mean, when you look at all this, it's I don't know. I forget where I was going with this, but
it's okay.
Yeah.
We'll get back. I want to wheel around to what is mostly in the headlines. We've been talking about sort of subterranean factors that are more subtle and less obvious. It's quite obvious that the two political parties hate each other, and that we are in this age of kind of toxic partisanship. Whereas in the 50s and even early 60s, the kinds of poll numbers you would get if you asked someone, how would you feel if your child married someone from another race, the kind of sort of reflexive terror you would get from those kind of poll numbers in the 50s. Now you get those. Now the racial fear has subsided dramatically, but now it has been replaced by partisan fear that if your daughter was to marry a MAGA hat wearer, well, that's just as bad as it could possibly get. And likewise on the other side. So we know this is going on. It's a very unusual state of affairs for American politics, not to have conflict, but to have ideologically polarized conflict. Our parties used to be these weird sort of grab bags of regional identities and not have a lot of sort of principled difference between them. Margaret, kind of walk us through this generation-long march of polarization and political sorting. Is it just purely inevitable? Did somebody make bad decisions? Is there blame to be handed out, or how do you see it?
So it's funny you mentioned the marriage element. I come from a tradition of what my father said at my wedding was Western conservatives, and there was actually a bit of what you described as the polarization at the wedding over who I was marrying. I wasn't marrying a MAGA hat wearer. I was marrying a centrist. And if you come from a long line of Republicans, and Herbert Hoover was one of them, Republicans don't marry Democrats, but they don't marry mushy moderates. And in some ways, that was even worse. I think people would have known what to do in the other circumstance. We would have known where to draw our lines. But I think rather than walking you through how we got to here, I mean, my experience in politics and my experience sort of in this realm is as someone of the center-right. I mean, somebody who identified with the ideas of the modern American conservative movement, most of them as espoused by Buckley and as led by Buckley. And I believe, and it's very humbling to have Sam Tannenhouse in the front row here, that he was right when he wrote that conservatism was dead in 2009, and that it took the conservative movement until maybe 2016 to truly recognize the consequences of frankly, the death of Buckley, and frankly, the death of leadership on the right. And what we had, I think, in those intervening years after that book was published, it was you had, I think, the significant failures of conservatism in the Bush administration, and the failures at the end of the Bush administration, particularly with a president who had claimed to be conservative, had quite confused some of the principles of conservatism, specifically the fiscal conservatism, and then the war in Iraq, and some of his just governing failures, I think led to a point where, of course, there was a overwhelming tide of support for the historic presidency of Obama, but then a real, I think, realization on behalf of operatives on the center-right who realized over time that the coalition that had been assembled, that had been successful, that had really codified the ideas of Buckley under Reagan, no longer had enough of a political constituency to get elected, not in 2012. And then again, in the primaries of 2016 is where it just became eminently apparent to people who, I see Avik Roy in the front row nodding, who was a really seminal and thoughtful thought leader and part of Rick Perry's campaign, who wrote one of the best speeches about how the Republican Party might bind together in a way that will attract a diverse, rising generation of Americans to a set of center-right ideas. And Rick Perry couldn't get anywhere. And what we recognize is that the ideas that we thought would be most attractive from the center-right that would appeal self-cannibalized in 2016, and many people, I think the expression of the failure of conservatism became, I think, most apparent in 2016 during those primaries. But it wasn't that Donald Trump took over the conservative movement. The conservative movement had already really burned itself to the ground, and Trump walked in the front door, is my view. And what has happened since then is that Donald Trump has taken over the Republican Party, the apparatus, its structures, and there are an increasing set of us who are here, as David articulated at the beginning, who have no home on the right, and certainly aren't going to find the answer to those questions and to the vehicle for the right ideas for the future of the country on the left either. We had talked about, really the conversation leading into 2016 was about asymmetrical polarization and how we were more polarized on the right than on the left. And maybe we just had a head start, is I think what has become clear as we begin to look at the Democratic Party having exactly the inverse experience that the Republican Party had in its 2016 primary process. There are many factors that have led to this polarization over time. I'm not sure where you.
Yeah, well, let's walk through sort of in detail where you focused on the last decade. So the way I see it, the governing conservatism discredited itself during the W. Bush years with a lot of big failures: Iraq, Katrina, financial crisis. And they paid a price. They got thumped in 06, and they got thumped in 08. So those are typically the kinds of, and I was happy that it happened. I thought, okay, I saw this kind of thing happen to Democrats in the 80s, that repeated electoral losses forces you back to the center, and I thought that kind of growing populist vibe of the Republican Party, which had come to sort of dominate concerns about policy and governance, that maybe this loss would shove that back in the box, but instead it just got worse. So, and then after 2012, there was the whole autopsy report. Hey, we've got to reach out to the rest of America, not just white guys. So both of these occasions, the 06-08 getting humbled by Democratic losses did not occasion anything other than a kind of a doubling down ethos. Likewise, after the Romney loss. How did that happen? And was there a failure of the good guys to make a more persuasive case, or was why was there momentum to keep going so irresistible?
Well, I think the party apparatus and structures actually aren't about ideas anymore. They're about retaining power, and they simply, unfortunately, made a calculation. And there's really a staph infection in I think on the Republican side and the Republican apparatus. And I just think they weren't actually about ideas. I don't think that autopsy report. Having spoken to Ari Fleischer about it when he was putting it together, I think actually that was a political tool to give Reince Priebus cover to be able to then go to his, because remember, when you're not in charge of the presidency, you don't select the party leader. It is the party, so really the most extreme members of the Republican Party apparatus who then elect the Republican Party leader. And I think Reince Priebus, who is a very practical and pragmatic person in many ways, needed some kind of a fig leaf to go to his party members to say we need to modernize and give him an excuse to support, in some of the cases of blue state Republicans, more moderate Republicans who didn't fit a hard right litmus test. in some of the primaries. I mean, frankly, that autopsy report was not this sort of high-minded, how do we win back America? It was really a device within the party structure to try to help win some seats that otherwise I think the party ideologues would not have permitted Republicans to compete in because they wouldn't adhere to a strict party ideology.
Let me wheel back to Francis and probe a little bit more on your narrative. So this is this a peculiarly American-specific state of affairs? Surely other countries have competitive politics. Do they go crazy too?
Well, I haven't done international comparisons. I think our institutions rely so heavily on successful cooperation between the parties that it's a system with checks and balances, separation of powers, many veto points. It's just about impossible to do anything on the strength of only one party. So we need bipartisanship to function. Now, not all systems require that, and so the way competition disincentivizes bipartisanship wouldn't matter the same way in a system that doesn't basically require it to function. I can say, though, I've taken a look at the 50 states,
okay.
And you can see that in states that are more two-party competitive, you see more party polarization in the state legislatures, both the upper and the lower chambers, and it's a nice and consistent pattern. There's some states that are off the regression line, but in general, that pattern holds. So there's a logic there that transcends just the national context. But what makes it problematic is that we have a system that requires bipartisanship to function.
So, but it feels weird that a huge problem is being caused by politics operating as you think it ought to, right? That you ought to have two competitive parties. And when we sort of moved to this 50-50 nation, it seemed to me that, okay, political markets are getting more efficient. That in the past, we had these long periods of Republican dominance and then Democratic dominance. But perhaps now, in our age of polling and better information access, that parties are able to tailor their message faster to chase the median voter or something like that, or at least chase 51%, if not the median voter. But that you could picture in that it would be sort of naturally in the course of things that a more efficient politics would be a more competitive politics because somebody's got to be doing something wrong to stay out of power for decades. So does that mean we have to that we can't do competitive and coherent politics at the same time?
Well, my argument does sort of run against, or contrary to the conventional wisdom that competition is always good for democracy. Or put it this way: maybe it's not the case that the more competition, the better. That maybe our system worked better during periods where you had a party that really commanded the trust of most Americans, so that that party could govern, and then could induce cooperation from the opposing party, because the opposing party was not constantly preoccupied with retaking majority control. Of course, in a democracy, you have to have an ability to criticize those in power, and you have to have an ability to hold them accountable. But this knife's edge politics may not be the most functional form in which competition can take.
So alas, when you look at the circumstances that led one party to be overwhelmingly trusted as the governing party, in the one case, it was that the other party fomented treason in a civil war and lost, right? So that discredited them pretty badly. Then on the other side, you had one party leading the country into the worst economic downturn ever, the other party pulling us gradually out of that, and then defeating the world's most evil tyranny of all time in the greatest armed conflict of all time. So those are unusual events on which to base this kind of consensus, strength of one party. That suggests then that we have to wait for some kind of crazy lightning strike to get back into that kind of situation.
I do think it's the case that the previous periods of long one-party dominance stemmed from the discrediting of the opposition more than a public endorsement or support of the agenda of the party in power. So, it was not a mandate to do X or Y. Instead, it was, well, we can't really trust the other side for various reasons, discrediting reasons. So it's not the happiest story there either. And another thing that you normally see is that a party with a secure majority tends to factionalize and fragment. That there's a lot more infighting in a dominant party. And that's also what you see in the States, where you've got a single party that's been in power for a really long period of time. It's a lot of infighting. But it's a more pluralistic politics. There's more play. The kinds of, a coalition can win on one issue, and then a different coalition wins on another. And in a system like the U.S., given the multiple centers of power, it may work better to have a loose, large majority party coalition in power. Can be criticized, can be thrown out, but maybe not thrown out every 2 years.
I mean, to the point, I mean, where is the center holding, right? Or why isn't the center holding? Right? We understand that it's polarization. We understand there are plenty of examples, both in Washington and in the states, where it's not holding. But the cases and the places where it is holding are in the states. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the outset of this, Larry Hogan in Maryland and Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. And the place where it's holding are where you do have these unconventional coalitions and frankly, leadership that are doing sort of the unconventional things. I mean, Larry Hogan is this extraordinary example when you think about it. He won 30% as a Republican being reelected in Maryland of the African-American vote.
Running against an African-American
Running
candidate.
against the former president of the NAACP,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, the center is holding in some places.
But here is you have a dominant party, and so Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan are they're of a type where you have a party that's just a state that is overwhelmingly Democratic, and then every once in a while they want a Republican to kind of come in and clean up house. But that's a particular model, but it affirms your point that you can get more coherent governance if you've got a sun party and a moon party. So, Martin, you've identified something new under the sun, information abundance, and you saw as the millennium switched, just from your perch at the CIA, things changed dramatically. Just to push a bit, this isn't the first time there have been crises of authority. Back in the 60s, people wore buttons saying, question authority. Robert Nisbet wrote a book in 1975, The Twilight of Authority. Certainly throughout the whole long 60s, people thought that we were undergoing a crisis of authority, that old verities were going by the boards, and there was this youth convulsion, and everything that had been sacred was being questioned. Then you can go farther. You can go farther back, and you can look at another period where a breakthrough in information technology led to social upheaval. The printing press the Reformation gives us a century plus of just unparalleled slaughter. So this is new under the sun in a way, but
yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything new under the sun in human affairs, and I think there are these periods, and I've gotten this question a lot, and as a student of history, I think it would be fascinating for somebody to go out there, smarter than me, and research these moments, these pivotal moments where old structures just seem to break down with tremendous rapidity. 1848, for example, and the French Revolution before that. But each one is determined by the conditions under which they take place. And I lived through the 60s too, and I was probably one of those hippies that was, believe it or not, that was out there demonstrating against the war and so forth. That was under a very certain set of assumptions and understandings of what being a radical was, all right? And essentially, if you pushed it hard enough, it meant you wanted to take over the government so that the government would do the radical things you wanted done. That is not the way things are right now. It's the strangeness about the radical movements in the last 15, 20 years is that they are very anti-government and very maybe some figure that runs the government. But in the end, they stand back and say, now you fix it. So they go to the very source that they are rebelling against and say, it is up to you now to make this right.
So it seems to me that there are real common elements between the sort of 60s New Left and these activated publics that you chronicle in Arab countries, in Greece, in Israel, Spain. The sort of amorphousness, the allergy to anything that looked like hierarchy was very much a New Left thing. The fact that it wasn't they weren't up against the wall in any kind of privation. The Port Huron Statement of 1962 starts out that we were raised in relative comfort or something like that. That these were people who had done pretty well by the system, but nonetheless had come to think that the system was irredeemably rotten. What is different, though, is they then wanted to, trash the system and run things themselves, whereas it feels like these new activated public movements, they just want to negate, blow the horns until the walls fall down, and then just go home and let somebody else build again.
Yeah, my favorite line from the Port Huron Statement is, every man an artist. I honestly don't know how representative the Port Huron people were. Yeah. I honestly don't know how representative even those of us who demonstrated in the streets were. The polls showed practically to the end of the Vietnam War that a majority of American youth supported the war. I think, on the other hand, when you flip to the present, this is, and I guess, let me back off. Maybe there's a case to be made that a lot of the anger that we perceive today is rhetorical anger. You cannot succeed in this information environment without making a very loud, angry noise, and hopefully finding somebody on the opposite side that you proclaim to hate, who's going to then heave it back at you, and you engage, and then you become a hero to your side, he becomes a hero to his side. How much of that anger is real? That's a really good question, okay? So there may be a sort of like silent, moderate mass out there that basically cannot express itself, because if you do not engage in that very angry sort of negation towards the other side, you will not be heard. You simply will not be heard.
Margaret, you talked about the Republicans and conservatives weren't able to learn the lessons of electoral losses in 06 and 08 or in 2012 because they had just run out of ideas. They had lost the capacity to form new ideas. And it seems to me part of that is because their old ideas worked and those issues went away. They had a big idea to win the Cold War, and they won the Cold War, and so that idea went away. They had a big idea that we need to be tough on crime, and then in the mid-90s, for reasons we still are trying to sort out, the crime wave, which had been one of the big sociological facts of the second half of the 20th century, just went into reverse. We don't know why. A lot of the big ideas that had been, foundational for conservatism during the Buckley years disappeared, and it seems like the failure was then to come up with a new act.
Well, I think that's basically right. I think the unifying principle of not the unifying principle, but the existential threat of the Cold War created a codifying and a cohesive sort of glue to the what one of the biographers of conservatism, or historians of the conservative, modern American conservative movement, who's not in the front row, George Nass, said that conservatism is not univocal, it is a wide river with many tributaries. And of the multiple factions, from economic libertarians to social conservatives to the evangelical Protestants in the South to the neoconservatives, all the different factions were really unified by the existential threat of the Cold War, and I don't think that anything has ever replaced that. I mean, that really began the unraveling of the modern American conservative movement that was sort of put together by Buckley and his peers. And I think there isn't an organizing principle on the right. Many have thought that maybe in the wake of 9/11, the existential threat of radical Islamism might sort of provide that same cohesiveness, and that hasn't borne out. But we're at a time, certainly on the right and the center right, where many thought too that sort of maybe fiscal principles of fiscal responsibility and intergenerational responsibility vis-a-vis Paul Ryan and his peers might offer this transcendent sort of codifying idea or theme that could be passed on. And that not only has that not borne out, that has also left Washington entirely. And now you had a president, of course, who, when he ran through the primaries, didn't even sort of agreed that he wouldn't even touch any of the entitlement programs that will have to be saved for new generations in order to continue in this opportunity society with a safety net, as the right likes to say. So there is no organizing principle on the right or on the center right or with the center left. But it's true that there are enough ideas that we agree on, and there is a moderate mass. There is a moderate majority of Americans that do have more in common on the center right and the center left than they do with the extremes on their own side.
So it seems to me that the Cold War, you point out that it provided coherence for the right, but it also imposed constraints on left-right, Republican, Democratic competition. There's just that idea that politics stops at the water's edge has more oomph to it when over on the other side of the water is some guy with 10,000 nukes aimed at you. And it seems to me like no big coincidence that the last president elected who was, however grudgingly, nonetheless obviously thought to be the legitimate president by the other side was George H.W. Bush, the last Cold War election. So subsequent to that, Clinton had scandal, and Republicans never thought he belonged in office and were always looking to oust him. Bush came in with the Florida hanging chads and was thought immediately to not really have won the election. Obama came in and he won handily, but still the birtherism controversy, that hairball got coughed up to challenge his legitimacy. And then, of course, Trump has launched a resistance in opposition to him. So these really grim sort of implications that good things like competitive politics or the end of an existential threat can produce terrible political results. That our relatively happy, more coherent politics was a feature of terrible things, of discrediting failures of political parties in the past or of enormous looming threats. Feels like we need something really bad to make us act responsibly.
I mean, just a footnote, 1988 was our last landslide presidential election.
Yes.
And so all of them have been much closer since then, and that's the red-blue map that's become sort of, how we talk about our politics. And so it's very challenging for a president to have that commanding legitimacy when he's only elected by about or slightly more than half the country, or even in some cases slightly less than half the country.
So the political polarization, its roots are in the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the end of the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party. Southerners had been held in the Democratic Party because of their focus on maintaining segregation, and Northern Democrats' acquiescence in that coalition held together. When it finally ruptured and the Civil Rights Act was passed, then you had this bunch of Southerners who were suspicious of a lot of government spending, didn't like high taxes, didn't like unions, were very hawkish. They had a lot of Republican characteristics otherwise, but they had been held in the Democratic column by race. Now, with that excuse gone, there is an argument that they just naturally then gravitated into the Republican Party. And that argument makes sense as far as it goes. What doesn't seem inevitable to me was that since Southerners had all these other things that pulled them towards the Republican Party, why did the Southern strategy have to dog whistle so much? So to specifically Southernify the Republican Party through kind of cultural war, coded or not so coded appeals to cultural conservatism in the South. That wasn't necessarily the path they had to take advantage of this new opportunity, but that's the path they took.
I identify and relate far more with the Western conservative themes and also sort of the Rockefeller Republican themes. So not having the personal understanding, but knowing a bit about the history of the South. I mean, this was the paradigm of the South. I mean, race and segregation. I mean, it's like if you go to Puerto Rico and you ask them what they think about. I mean, they don't think about anything other than statehood. I mean, statehood is the predominant political issue in Puerto Rico. I think in the South, segregation and integration and the Civil Rights Act and race was the defining theme. So I think the other issues you mentioned were secondary, tertiary, but there was the number one issue was one.
Francis, tell me.
Of people who identify with the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is more diverse than the country as a whole. So that racial divide between the parties is much deeper. That's going to fuel further antagonism. That's a social dimension to our polarization, and that affects. And so, if you are the leader of a party that's organized in a way, represents a social cleavage that's grounded heavily in race now, then that escalates those issues. I think in some ways it's not surprising that a more truculent populism grounded in racial resentment has come to the fore post-2016. I think that was building for a long time, decades of where the parties were sorting out, so not just geographically, but also sorting out along racial lines.
So it's not just that the parties have split into a left party and a right party, but that the axis of left-right conflict these days is much more about culture than it is about economics. That seems to me to be a contributing factor to the nastiness of our politics. Of course, you can have class war politics that's violent and uproarious, but there is a potential to compromise on dollars and cents issues that's lacking in conflicts over religion, over race, where there's nothing to compromise over. So why did we switch from an economics-based political competition to a culture-based competition? There's a lot of reasons. One, seems to me, is that a group of media entrepreneurs came to be in this more open information environment and saw a huge market opportunity in conservative media, and basically in pandering to the resentments of an audience that their views and their cultural sensibility wasn't being reflected in the national Eastern liberal elite media. And so these were a bunch of, first in talk radio, then Fox News, and then on the internet and through social media, a bunch of people who saw, we can make a lot of money getting people mad as hell and not wanting to take it anymore, and riling them up on cultural lines. Do you think that this was just, they were just riding a wave and they were just catering to what the audience wanted, or is there agency on the part of these media entrepreneurs that they have led us towards this more culture war kind of politics?
I'd say, well, it's not unprecedented in U.S. history, so I wouldn't suggest that something about the media environment today is different than the past. I mean, the post-Civil War, the decades of the late 19th century, the party divide was very much on the basis of Romanism, and rebellion. So, that gaffe, which sort of summed up what the parties were really fighting about. They didn't disagree on economic issues. They didn't have big programmatic differences during that period, so before 1896. So I see that period, that's a period of lots of identity politics. And so we have it again. So it wasn't impossible for that to arise at a time when communications were much slower and much less. The country was much less knit together, and yet we still had politics very much grounded in social identity.
So let's try to be hopeful. Are there any indicators or any potentialities for things to get better? Martin, You seem to be shaking your head. How does Humpty Dumpty put himself back together again?
You know, I constantly get called like a techno-pessimist and a dark prophet. I really am not. I really am not. And I look at what's happening now, and it could be, it's so complex. I mean, I think the characteristics are clear, and the outlines you can sort of devise and divine, but it may well be that what we're experiencing today is not some sort of tremendous permanent imploding of democracy, for example, or our political institutions. We just may be going through a tremendous transition moment. And the transition includes the media, I think, big time, information, big time, includes the fact that the public is empowered big time. I do not believe in, I mean, there's an elite idea that anything that the public follows that they don't like, there must be some elite that's manipulating them. I do not believe that necessarily. But also the fact that the baby boomers, us, me, are, you know, we're not that young anymore. We're yielding to a new generation. And I think that new generation was born and bred very differently than ours, in a different world than ours. And I think we just, what we need to do is manage this in a way that all the essential goods of American society, of which there are so many, are protected. And hopefully, when the kids take over, they will have as good a life as ours. I am not a pessimist.
So,
I'll weigh in with one institution that I think that has not been undercut, just that the constitutional system itself has rock solid legitimacy with the public, and that's a wonderful asset that we have.
A good one.
And so the continued support for this system, and it's a compromise-inducing political system. It's just about impossible to do anything simply on the strength of one party. So that's something we were trying to end on a happy note.
So also, we have this politics now that's where contestation is mostly about cultural differences, and our dividing lines, our political fissures are along racial, ethnic, cultural, religious lines. And that seems to be a much more combustible kind of politics than one that's arguing about dollars and cents. Could the fact that the Democrats now are much more ambitious on their left side than they have been in quite some time, and are pushing for and are thinking about major new initiatives to expand the role of government in this way or that way, could that then summon into being a more substantive center-right opposition, and we finally have some sort of big stakes economic stuff to argue about again, and could that then divert us away from arguing about who's a real American and who isn't?
I mean, one would hope. Often my experience on the right is that the right spends its time articulating and fighting what it doesn't like on the left rather than coming up with constructive solutions to counter that. But we can always hope. Yeah. I do think, though, it's to this larger point about whether there is a moment for a centrism to really adhere and hold a political gravitas in the middle. And we're not there now. Obviously, this is not exactly that moment, but this is the time to begin building that moment, because the right has, and the right and the center right and what is left of the ideas of the modern American conservative movement still have merit and have no home politically. And while they may not have their home politically on the right, because of what I think we're about to endure in terms of the Democratic primary and the left, the emergence of the far left, there is going to be, in the nearer future than it has been ever before, a moment and an opportunity for the center right and the center left to begin to build a new national narrative that is one of unity and that is one of cohesion, and that it is an antidote to the moment of polarization in politics, because it is true that the millennials are far more pragmatic and interested in problem solving than they are in labels. And it is also true that the generation behind them seems to have those characteristics even more so. So I don't want to say blithely, oh, the kids are going to get it better than us. But I do think that the moment is nearer than it has ever been, and that it is why it is so important that these conversations begin now, that we begin to build this architecture now, this language now, so that there is an opportunity for leadership then to step into its place. And that is how we have successful political movements in this country. I mean, that was what is the work, frankly, that Buckley did in the early in the 50s and the 60s to build what became an architecture for the conservative movement. That has to happen again, but in the center, or the center right, and that's the good work that you're doing here today.
Well, from your lips to God's ears. We have time for a couple of questions. Arnold, and wait for a microphone.
It seems to me there are forces of social division that are much stronger than they ever were. General Motors, whatever the class differences, we're all in this together. You had blue-collar workers and white-collar workers dependent on each other, and they knew that. Google doesn't face that. Facebook doesn't face that. We know the distribution of income changing. We know that colleges and the rest of the country are in different places. We know that college-educated women and non-college-educated men now form, in some sense, the base of the Democratic and Republican parties, respectively, and they're very far apart. Given that, is a politics of love even possible? Is there any way you can put that Humpty Dumpty back together?
Time will tell. But I mean, it is a sobering question. So and you talk a lot about the kind of contrast between the industrial age and these mass movements, and we have demassified. So we had mass production industries with huge workforces that tied them to capital because there are all these huge enterprises, and they had a kind of coincidence of interest. These kind of top-down politics where the masses received instruction from the leaders and occasionally, would have a spasm, but really couldn't coordinate to do anything like they can do these days. So we have definitely disintegrated, and that has bred disintegration. But I wrote a book, Age of Abundance, about the culture war of the 60s and 70s, and then all of these things that were tearing us apart at that time, suddenly in the 90s, it seemed like a lot of those old culture war conflicts were healing during that time. So could we just be in a messy transition now that we will find a kind of a new equilibrium, maybe a more local equilibrium than the big mass level coherence that we had before? I think, Martin, you're sniffing around looking for some kind of lower level of authority that's closer to people and that is therefore less vulnerable to.
Obviously, I mean, 100% what David said about decentralization. The old industrial mindset was one size fits all. You cannot do policies like that, I don't think, anymore, because you're going to alienate 70% of the public, and you're going to probably spark a revolt somewhere. So the more you push down to the localities and to the states, we seem to be politically divided along geographic lines. I think the less that's going to happen. Also, one last thing I would say is we are moving at internet speed. Political landscapes change with amazing, amazing speed. So all these dark things that we see right now could swirl around tomorrow. And I keep using France as my example because it's like an archetype. I mean, Macron came from nowhere, okay? He completely blitzed through a political system that was completely fossilized and basically totally unwelcoming of newcomers. His party was set up a year before he won his election. And there he was, the hero Macron, the new man. And within a year, this Yellow Vest revolt came in and down goes Macron. Neither of those events would have been predictable. They happened with the speed of light, which is the speed of the internet, of course.
I guess one thought here, too, is we don't want to mistake a polarizing discourse for genuine polarization on issues. That the loud voices are not necessarily representative. And that's true of social media. It's also true in Congress that if you're looking at the new Congress, the 116th Congress, so we hear, the new voices of the emergent, far left in the Democratic Party, but they're way out of proportion to their numbers in the new House of Representatives. That the Democrats have their majority now because they won lots of suburban seats, New Jersey and Houston and Southern California. These members are not out there, really active in social media, trumpeting an alternative narrative, but they're there and they would have to vote on issues. So the center can hold on issue in Congress and in politics, the country as a whole, even when our discourse is very antagonistic.
Right here. Here comes the mic, right?
I'm Mike Nelson. I used to be a professor of internet studies at Georgetown, and I am a cyber optimist still. I'm also struck by the point you just made, which is things are moving incredibly fast. And we are developing new tools and new ways that we can counter disinformation. We might even get algorithms that push us towards consensus instead of away from consensus. I'd be interested if any of you were the chief engineer of the internet or Facebook, how would you redesign the internet so it might be a force for centrism instead of polarization?
Wouldn't touch that one. I am by temperament, and I guess that's all you can go by. Let it fly, man. So I would not redesign anything. I would take down as many barriers to speech as possible.
That sounds like your job to figure it out for us.
Drop me a line when you do.
And right here for our final question.
I'm Deborah DeVegin, and I run thechisel.com. So we have a bipartisan civic engagement platform in which we do exactly that. All the proposals that are posted on thechisel.com are jointly created by American Enterprise Institute and Urban Institute, or American Enterprise Institute and Brookings Institution, and a whole host of other bipartisan and multi-stakeholder groups at the community, at the state, and the federal level. So go to the site. It's free. You can post your proposals.
Good question.
Thank you very much. That's a helpful, constructive note on which to end. We have hit the end of our time. I want to thank the panelists very much for your decisive and interesting thoughts. We have a brief break here in between panels.
Right.
Great.
Nice to meet you. Silicon Valley folks.